Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the strangest, honestly most bizarrest success stories in the entire history of science toys. If you've ever flipped the pages of an old comic book, you've definitely seen the pitch. It sounded like pure magic, right? Just add water and boom, you've got an entire underwater civilization swimming around right in your bedroom. Well, today we're going to look right past that incredible vintage branding and focus on the actual science of what sea monkeys really are. I am so excited to guide you through this because trust me, the true story, the biological reality of these little creatures is arguably even more fascinating than the marketing fantasy. Seriously, do you remember those retro comic book ads promising instant pets? Or maybe you just remember the massive cultural footprint they left behind. The promise was incredibly simple, but man, was it powerfully alluring, buying instant life right through the mail. You'd mail in your spare change, and in return, you'd get this tiny packet that promised a bowl full of living, breathing, playing creatures. It was literally the ultimate childhood dream delivered straight to your mailbox. But really, think about it. How did a tiny packet of what essentially looked like a pinch of dust turn into a multi-generational cultural phenomenon? Well, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the comic book fantasy. You absolutely cannot talk about sea monkeys without talking about that legendary 1960s branding. They sold an absolute dream to millions of kids. The expectation? Pure magic. Kids saw these amazing illustrations of smiling, humanoid underwater families living in majestic little castles. They were wearing little crowns, doing very human-like activities. It looked like a cartoon come to life. But the reality? Microscopic brine shrimp swimming around in a very small plastic tank. For so many of us, setting up that tank was a profound and maybe slightly disappointing moment of realization. But here's the secret to their massive success. It was exactly that huge gap between the wild imagination of the ads and the stark reality of the tank that made the whole experience so incredibly exciting and unforgettable. Now that we've stripped away the vintage branding, we arrive at Section 2, the Science of Cryptobiosis. So the true star of our explainer isn't some fictional aquarium monster. It's a very real, very tiny crustacean called Artemia, or as most people know them, brine shrimp. In the wild, these little guys naturally hang out in harsh, salty lakes where most other animals simply can't survive. To handle those extreme environments, they actually possess a real-life biological superpower called cryptobiosis. This is basically a state where organisms completely shut down their metabolism and turn into dormant cysts to survive extreme conditions. When their natural lakes dry up, they don't just die. Instead, they hit pause. They turn into these tiny cysts that look totally identical to lifeless grains of dust. And then, they just wait. They can hang out in this suspended animation until they're dropped back into the right saltwater conditions, at which point, boom, they miraculously spring back to life. Now, what's really mind-blowing about this is just how far those survival capabilities actually stretch. We're not just talking about surviving a dry summer here. In their cyst form, these things can endure severe dehydration, they can literally survive exposure to radiation, and, most importantly for the toy industry, they can last for years or even decades in this state of dormancy. This little biological trick, this crazy ability to just pause life and pack it away indefinitely, is the one single reason why you can walk into a toy store and buy instant life in a little paper packet. So, how exactly did this cool bit of science get transformed into a massive commercial empire? Well, back in the late 1950s, a guy named Harold von Braunhut saw huge potential in these dormant brine shrimp eggs. He realized that with the right instructions, you could package them up and sell them as an instant pet. But let's be honest, brine shrimp doesn't exactly sound thrilling, right? So he rebranded them as sea monkeys, a totally playful name designed purely to spark curiosity. Then, the 1960s hit, the comic book ad boom really took off, and they started selling that wild fantasy we talked about earlier. And today? The branding has actually evolved quite a bit. Those exaggerated humanoid families are mostly gone, replaced by a focus on reality, which has turned them into highly effective STEM learning tools for classrooms and homes. Which brings us right to Section 3, creating instant life. Setting up one of these kits means you're literally recreating a harsh, natural ecosystem right there on your desktop. It actually requires some precision. First, you've got to mix the salt to the exact concentration of their natural environment. You definitely can't just drop these eggs into regular topwater. Then you add the dormant eggs, those little specks of dust. And finally, the waiting begins. You wait for the newborn sea monkeys, scientifically known as Nauplii, to hatch. And that period of suspense is absolutely crucial. At first, the water just looks totally empty, or maybe just a little cloudy. But then, within a day or two, you start to see these almost invisible little specks slowly moving around. It's a genuinely fascinating scientific moment where dormant life suddenly becomes active again right in front of your eyes. And once they hatch, the observation really kicks into gear. Sure, they start out as microscopic Nauplii, but they definitely don't stay that way. As they grow, you can watch them gradually develop into actual shrimp-like creatures. You literally start to visibly see their tails. They develop small, swimming appendages that they use to just sort of zip themselves through the tank. And get this, they even develop gills for breathing. To fuel all that growth, they feed on tiny particles in the water, like algae, or that special little packet of diet food included in the commercial kits. So how long do you actually get to enjoy this little desktop ecosystem? Usually several months, but that depends entirely on maintaining a pretty delicate environment. You've got to ensure good water quality, adequate oxygen, and just the right temperature. If you can manage to keep those variables in check, these little extremophiles will happily live out their entire life cycle right there before your eyes. Let's move along and see how all this builds into our final segment. Section 4, a lasting biological legacy. So we know what they are and we know how they grow. But why do we still care about them decades after those original comic book ads? Why hasn't the fascination just faded away? Well, in the scientific realm, brine shrimp are incredibly important. Researchers use them all the time to study extreme adaptation, dehydration, and radiation resistance. Their eggs are so remarkably durable that they could be shipped anywhere in the world without refrigeration, which, by the way, is exactly why the sea monkey business model still works perfectly today. And then in the educational realm, they're a total staple. They sit right in that sweet spot between a simple science experiment and a living pet. They're easy enough for a kid to care for, but they allow students to observe real-time biology, like ecosystems, life cycles, and dormancy, without needing a bunch of expensive laboratory equipment. So the crucial point here is captured beautifully by this quote. That gap between expectation and reality is what made them so memorable. Because beyond the education and the hardcore science, sea monkeys carry a really heavy dose of emotional nostalgia for a lot of us. So many of us remember that childhood experience of waiting eagerly by that little plastic tank. We remember just hoping to see a tiny flicker of movement, and we definitely remember feeling that very distinct mix of wild excitement and slight confusion when the microscopic swimming dots didn't exactly look like the majestic kings and queens from the comic book. It really is a neat piece of science perfectly wrapped up in childhood nostalgia. Ultimately, sea monkeys show us how organisms can literally pause, survive the impossible, and just restart. They turn invisible biology into something you can witness firsthand on your desk, which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to think about. What other invisible biology might be hiding right now in a tiny packet of dust? It's a great reminder that our world is incredibly complex, and that even the smallest, seemingly lifeless organisms can spark massive curiosity. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep looking closely at the simple things around you because, honestly, you never know what kind of life is just waiting to be activated.